Welcome back to the Old Testament Prophets. I'm Jerry, and we are in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. Last week we looked at the spectacular vision of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. A stone from a mountain hit the image at the time of the feat and toppled the statue representing the flow of nations in the Near East from Babylon, if you recall last week. The stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Well, there's no doubt that the stone represents Jesus, the Messiah, made without hands, speaks to his virgin birth. The stone sets up a kingdom very different from those represented by the image. Planted like a tiny mustard seed, God's kingdom has grown and will continue to grow and will, through eternity, be a triumphant, visible kingdom, while the nations of the world will disappear at the end of time. Now, notice what happened right after Daniel revealed the vision and the interpretation. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. So the king fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, something the king never does with another person, and acknowledged this God in the heavens who worked through Daniel. Now the king is gushing so much here that he even orders incense and offering for Daniel, the stuff usually only for the gods. Not that he mistakes Daniel for a god, I don't think, but he is definitely overwhelmed at the God of heaven and how Daniel was his prophet. And Daniel received a great promotion, ultimately from the Lord. And Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So then Daniel promoted his three friends, with the king's permission. These three were in charge over the affairs of this capital region, Babylon. And God no doubt gifted these young men with exceptional administrative abilities for this. Okay, now let's begin the story in Daniel chapter 3, which takes place an unknown number of years after Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the image in chapter 2. It could have been the next year or 20 years later. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So 60 cubits is about 90 feet, a tall statue. Not unique in the ancient world, but not common either. It was 9 feet wide, so the proportions are not right for an image of a person, unless it was on a pedestal about as tall as the statue. That is, as tall as the person represented in the statue. It was constructed somewhere outside the city. Now, about 6 miles southeast, there is a place with 4 walls containing something that might be suitable for that. If so, one could see this from the city. I don't have a picture of that site, and it's anybody's guess if it was there. But someplace out of the city. Now, 90 feet was not an unusual height in Babylonian architecture. The ziggurat structure in Babylon, if you see that big pyramid-like structure, is estimated to have been 280 feet high, and the towers on the walls 60 feet. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the king brought all of the levels of their national, regional, and local government to this dedication, including those provincial leaders, those leaders of the provinces from all over the empire. They came for at least this dedication. Now, my guess is that when you bring all of your provincial leaders from such long distances, months' journey for some, you're going to have more than a 2-hour event. It might have been a several-day or week affair involving business and policy meetings just to make sure everyone is doing what Nebuchadnezzar wants. And if that's so, maybe this capstone event was this ceremony, which might have been done each day. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages. You are commanded that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be immediately cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Almost certainly, bowing and worshiping the image was not a problem for these leaders from all over Babylon. As I've noted, in the ancient world, it was understood there were many gods, and they generally did not compete for devotion. It took a lot of gods to run the world and the heavens. So regardless of your own traditional gods, it was not a sin to give moments of devotion to whatever Babylonian god of this image, except the faithful Jews. We'll see if any Jews get caught up in this. Obviously, this was like a loyalty oath today, a public expression of loyalty to both religion and state. Who's with the program and who isn't? Religion and state were intermingled then. Being loyal meant worshiping the right gods, religion, and obedient to the king, reigning under the god's protection and blessing. There's the state. So evidently, Nebuchadnezzar felt the need to shore up allegiance and loyalty in the empire. Was he thinking of his dream image where the head of gold, himself, was replaced by the next kingdom made of silver? Possibly. The penalty for not worshiping was immediate execution, not banishment, no trial, just immediate execution by burning, an established form of public execution noted in the Babylonian law code of Hammurabi. Enforced in all the minds and hearts of all was the life and death seriousness of not being with Nebuchadnezzar's program and gods. Bowing to the image, easy. Check off the box for religion. Being loyal, completely loyal to Nebuchadnezzar, the box for state, well, they'd better take that seriously because this king means business. Now let's consider, what does the image represent? The Bible does not say. It's enough that it represented something worshipped other than the true God. Some think the image was of Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps inspired by that earlier vision when he was the golden head. but in my opinion, this is not likely. First, because the Babylonians did not worship their kings as gods, as some other nations, like Egypt, did. And this was worship, not just a very respectful bow to the image, because the Jews would not have had a problem with a bow, because that was a cultural way of showing respect then. A second reason the image was probably not the king is that there are many of Nebuchadnezzar's royal writings available. He kept the scribes busy, and there are two themes consistent in his writings. First, he was a builder and conqueror. So if he wasn't chronicling a new building or renovation plan, he was probably describing his victory over other nations. The second theme was that he was a devout worshiper of Marduk and Marduk's son, Nebo or Nabu, from whom Nebuchadnezzar was named. These were the chief gods of Babylon, Marduk and Nebo. So these were not controversial choices. The bricks that were used in Nebuchadnezzar's many building programs were stamped with the statement, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who cares for Esagila and Ezida, the eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. Esagila was the temple of Marduk, and Ezida was the temple of Nabu, or Nebo. Here's another testimony from him. I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the exalted prince, the favorite of the god Marduk, the beloved of the god Nabu, the arbiter, the possessor of wisdom, who reverences their lordship, the untiring governor, who is constantly anxious for the maintenance of the shrines of Babylonia and Borsippa. Borsippa was where Nabu was especially worshipped. By thy command, merciful Marduk, may the temple I have built endure for all time, and may I be satisfied with its splendor. End quote. So Nebuchadnezzar doesn't seem to at all be a person to be worshipped as a god. That just wasn't how Babylonians thought. A third reason against the king's image is that even if the king ever did have such a maverick notion to be worshipped, he was very smart. And this would not have been a smart thing to do, because that would turn almost everyone in the kingdom against him. Yes, maybe he could force the compliance of many with the threat of the furnace execution, but erecting such an offensive image of himself would completely sabotage any unity and loyalty in the kingdom, which he prizes both very highly. Now, a fourth thought is, why build an image when he's still alive? They could face his throne where his majesty sits. Those monarchs in that time who accepted worship accepted it and wanted it personally. No, I think what Nebuchadnezzar wanted was not king worship, but universal allegiance and support. And he planned to get more of that through the image, whatever it was. So what would have the image represented if not Nebuchadnezzar? Since it was worshipped, it must have been the image of a god or gods. Was it the god Marduk, who was esteemed as the most important god in Babylon? Here's a scene from the Enuma Elish creation epic showing Marduk on our right defeating the chaos monster Tiamat, and then he created the world from her body. Well, now we know. But then there's also Marduk's son Nabu, or Nebo, the god of writing, wisdom, and the scribes. And perhaps most relevant here, Nabu, or Nebo, was Nebuchadnezzar's patron god, where the first letters of Nebuchadnezzar's name came from. And interestingly, Nabu inscribed the fates of men on the tablet of destiny. And at the annual 12-day Babylonian Akitu festival, their most important festival, the god Nabu gave a prophecy for the coming year that was recorded by the priests. So here was the second most powerful god who could give prophecies and held that tablet of destinies. Interesting topics to Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps, who lives with the knowledge of that prophetic dream that outlined the destinies of these nations. Now, at one point in the Akitu festival, the images of Marduk, Nabu, and many other Babylonian gods were brought together in proximity to the king, who is seen before all in favor with these gods. And by the way, the Akitu festival is still celebrated on April 1st in Iraq. It's a New Year's celebration. So while we don't know for sure what image was represented, I give it a good chance it was Nebuchadnezzar's namesake, the god Nabu or Nebo. So that by the people worshiping Nebo for those musical moments, Nebuchadnezzar gets a simultaneous boost in legitimacy and favor by being the king that Nabu supports. And this brief worship time would not be understood as dismissing the many other Babylonian gods, just a special time to recognize Nabu and the king he endows with his wisdom. But again, Nabu is just a guess. I think it's a good guess, but ultimately we don't know. By the way, this event is reminiscent of the Tower of Babel, which was, as in Babylon, which was raised as a high point that many faced in an attempt to achieve unity. Jewish tradition holds that this image that Nebuchadnezzar made was upon the very site of that original tower. And we say, who knows? One last thought. In our journey so far in Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar, one of the great and memorable kings of history, the stories have centered around certain commands of the king so far in Daniel. And what the king commands is done, period. But do we see a pattern here with the king's commands in Daniel? First, the command for the Jews' diet from the king's table, which unwittingly was pushing the Jewish captives into sin. And then in chapter 2, the command to kill all the wise men, which just so happened to net Daniel and his 3 friends, and perhaps the other Jewish captives. In chapter 3, the command to worship the image. Who will be harmed in Babylon by this command? Well, probably not many, but probably the faithful Jews. So all of these commands affected the Jews negatively, sometimes dangerously. But at the same time, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't seem to be intentionally attacking the Jews. He almost certainly didn't know about Leviticus and the Jewish diet in chapter 1. He gave the command to kill all those incompetent wise men. They were the focus of his rage, and the Jewish young men were just caught up in this, chapter 2. And then the command to worship the image in chapter 3 was not given to snare the Jews. The king doesn't seem to be bent that way. It was a shrewd political maneuver for his own kingship. The king doesn't need this image to harm the Jews. He's the king. If he wanted to harm them, he would just do so. So, was this all a coincidence about the Jews being harmed? Or was there some kind of sinister power at work here behind Nebuchadnezzar, through Nebuchadnezzar? A power that hated the Jews, the people of God, and wanted their destruction. In the New Testament, Paul wrote an interesting phrase about those who are spiritually lost. He said they were in, quote, the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. End quote. 2 Timothy 2:26. Nebuchadnezzar was doing what he thought good for himself. But was he also accomplishing Satan's will here to exterminate these few faithful Jews God was using? Now, I can't see into that invisible realm, but it just seems the harmful effects of these royal commands are more than coincidental. And if you know the rest of the stories in Daniel, you know this pattern against the Jews continued. Nevertheless, the Lord worked in chapters 1 and 2 to help Daniel and his 3 friends, and even work out good from them, like their promotions, and especially to glorify the God of heaven. So next week, Lord willing, let's see what happens in this new challenge. Thanks very much.